You are listening to the Overthinker's Guide to Joy, episode 41. This is the one where we're going to talk about walking on eggshells. Let's dive in. This is a podcast for overthinkers, overdoers, and overachievers who are tired of feeling over-anxious and just want to feel better. I'm your host, certified life coach, Jackie DeCrenis. Hey there, and welcome back. So today I want to talk about a subject that comes up all of the time in my sessions, and it's a subject that I struggled with for many years of my life. And so I thought it would be an interesting subject to share with you all and see if it doesn't resonate with some of you as well. And that's the issue of walking on eggshells, especially with certain people in your life. And just to clarify the expression, this is when we have when we behave in a hyper-vigilant way when interacting with certain types of people to avoid upsetting them. And you know those types. They're people who are either passive-aggressive or aggressive-aggressive or volatile. And we just feel like we're always tippy-toeing around them because we're not sure of their mood or how they'll react to something. And we end up not being our most authentic selves around them for fear of upsetting them, or they'll be angry at us, or they'll be punitive to us in some way. Now, oftentimes people who walk on eggshells will notice that this is a pattern in their life. It may not be with everyone. There may be many people that they feel comfortable with and safe with, but they may have it in a pattern with their bosses, or it may have come from a relationship or still be a relationship with their parent or a sibling, or maybe their partner, or sometimes just a friend. And while most of us have encountered this dynamic with someone at some point, others of us have maybe had this pattern their whole lives. So when I was little, I had this relationship with my childhood best friend. She was kind of the queen bee, a little bit of the mean girl, very cliquish, and she was moody. So sometimes she was nice, sometimes she was mean, sometimes she invited me, sometimes she didn't. And we were friends for years. I've written about this and even talked about it in former podcasts. But it was always this sort of walking on eggshells feeling with her, like, what will I do or what might I do today that would upset her? And it was a terrible relationship to have. I mean, we were very good friends and we have since overcome that and have been friends for almost 50 years. But at the time, I just didn't know what that was about. And then later, although I didn't do it with other girlfriends, I did it with boys I dated. And then eventually, when I overcame that, I started seeing this pattern show up with my bosses, because I had some very difficult bosses when I worked in the entertainment business. But at that point, I just chalked it up to it's the entertainment business. And there's a lot of difficult people in that industry. People with big egos, people who are notoriously volatile. And there's so much uncertainty in those jobs that you just sort of make excuses and assume, well, this is the norm. But it wasn't until much later that I realized I was attracting this pattern into my life. And it was manifesting in different ways. And so because it looked different throughout my life, I didn't think it was a pattern. And then I realized, oh, this is the pattern of walking on eggshells. So if you have a history of walking on eggshells with someone close to you, then you may be unconsciously attracting those people into your life too. So the question is why? Like, why would we consciously or unconsciously attract people who make our lives more difficult? Well, there isn't one simple answer. There never is. But it's most likely to come from something in our childhood that got wired in the wrong way. Like many homes, there may have been dysfunction or disruption, or specifically a parent who maybe suffered from alcoholism or drug addiction, borderline personality disorder, or narcissism. Any one of those things can cause a child to develop this coping mechanism known as walking on eggshells. So when we're little, our life is dependent on the adult or adults in charge in our house. So finding or creating safety, whether that's emotional or physical, becomes paramount to us. And a child who wants simply just more attention or approval from their parent or caregiver may bend over backwards trying to figure out which behavior will create more stability, more safety. So in some cases, an erratic parent, whether it's due to chemical addiction like alcohol or biochemical imbalances like narcissism, what I often see is my clients will describe how great it was when that parent was really loving towards them, when they weren't drunk or when they were on their medication or when they were just in not a manic state. They were often charismatic, charming, and intelligent. So because that parent is often charismatic and charming and intelligent, it becomes like an addiction for the child to hit the jackpot and figure out how to make them happy or how to not set them off. Now, as a result of this behavior or pattern, they then carry this habit into their adult life, attracting either friends or lovers or bosses who have similar characteristics to their own parents. Now, they thought when they were younger that it was their job to keep the peace, not upset them, or just make them happy. But this is way too much responsibility for a child. So the wiring is wrong. It's screwed up. It's twisted. And so the pattern becomes dysfunctional. So one of the things I hear amongst a lot of my clients who had difficult upbringings with an unpredictable mother or father was that when their mother or father was behaving, as they say, they made them feel very special. They often describe their parent as so loving or charming or fun that when they were okay, they just wanted more of it. So they loved that side of them so much, they would do everything to make them happy and avoid upsetting them, kind of at all costs, and almost at their own self-identity, because their whole mission in life was to try and recreate that feeling of that adoration that they got from their volatile parent, who was then at times charming and charismatic and very loving. So, like I said, when they became adults on their own, they carried this habit into their other relationships. So what happens is the pattern becomes they spend their lives either trying to make everyone else happy all the time or fixating on the most difficult person in their life and always trying to make them happy. And we've all seen people like this. We've all seen people who are in marriages where the spouse is so disgruntled or so volatile, and yet the wife or the husband bends over backwards to make them happy. And even though they leave such wreckage in their wake with their moods and their volatility, and yet the spouse is always sort of cleaning up after them and making excuses for them. So that person, as a child, thinks they needed to be perfect or super helpful or never make a mistake to avoid the wrath of the volatile parent. And they mistakenly think if they could just make that parent calm or just make that parent happy, then they themselves would feel safe. But that never really happens, because when you have a pattern of unpredictability, you never feel safe. And eventually this leads to very low self-esteem, oftentimes poor health, and chronic anxiety and or depression. So when we finally are free from the unpredictable volatile caregiver, again, why do we unconsciously repeat this pattern in our adult lives? Because we erroneously think there's a reward. We think that we'll feel safer or more loved if we can just please the most difficult person in our life. The walking on eggshells person is ultimately seeking just two things: safety and approval. The very things they didn't get from their childhood. But they saw glimmers of it, just enough to keep them coming back and trying for more. It's almost like a gambler's mentality. You win just enough to put more coins in the slot machine thinking you're going to hit the jackpot. And oftentimes, it's the most creative and charismatic people who suffer the most from terrible mood swings and tortured souls, which is that either biochemical imbalance or sometimes leads to that external chemical addiction, like, again, alcohol or drugs. So the truth is, we might be attracted to them in our adult life because they're familiar to us, that type of person, that charming, captivating, seemingly soulful human being when they're on their best behavior. We know this dynamic seems familiar, but we think it will be different this time. I personally made this mistake over my lifetime in both friendships and romantic partnerships, and definitely with the bosses that I talked about. And they all had one thing in common. They were all notoriously charming, charismatic, and maybe a little bit narcissistic. So when we continue to tolerate this pattern of walking on eggshells with erratic or volatile people, we perpetuate our own illusion or delusion that if we're just hypervigilant enough, if we're just good enough, we can please them. And we think that if we just behave in that certain way, we will engender gratitude and loyalty from them. And then we can finally feel safe and loved. But the truth is, we've given away our safety by tolerating and indulging this behavior. We become a prisoner of our own making. And rather than developing our own sense of self, solidifying our own self-worth, we become chameleons. We twist ourselves into a pretzel to avoid upsetting our volatile counterpart. We become people pleasers. And I did a whole podcast on this a few months ago. I think it's episode 15 called Overcoming People-Pleasing Paralysis. So how do you know if you're prone to walking on eggshells? Well, here are some questions you might ask yourself. Number 1, do you have a high sensitivity to everyone in your environment? Are you always noticing anything that might be off, like maybe at a restaurant or a party or at work? Some people call this being an empath, where you're highly attuned to others' feelings, people you don't even know. Another sign might be, are you always feeling kind of tense? Are you always on the lookout for danger or emotional upset? Now, if the answer is yes to either or both of these questions, is this possible that it came from your childhood? And if so, can you identify the root of it? Was there someone who you sought out their approval, but their attention was unpredictable or unstable? Or was there a situation in your household that created unpredictability or instability? Might have been divorce or death or war or something. So what can you do about it now? Because that's the past and you can't change the past. And part of what I do as a coach is not get mired in the past, but give you tools to work forward so that you can change the narrative in your life. Well, what can you do about it? Number 1, starts with self-care. It always comes back to this. Self-care is how you create the foundational strength you need to be your best self in the world. And when you make yourself a priority, that's both mind and body, you show up differently in the world. Number 2, get professional help. Whether you hire a therapist to work through your issues of childhood trauma, or you hire a coach to help you learn tools for better self-care and discovering what you want and need going forward in your life, or both. But get the help that you need. And number 3, set boundaries. If you're in a relationship that is dangerous, emotionally or physically, then you need to seek help to remove yourself safely from that situation. That's paramount. But if your issue is not one of imminent danger, but it's still taking a toll on your life, then you need to be able to set those boundaries. So when things are neutral, that is not in the heat of someone's outburst or disagreement, you need to schedule a time to sit and talk to them, rationally and calmly. You need to be able to explain your thoughts and feelings without judgment. It's just stating your truth, your thoughts and feelings from a place of love. And that can be even with a work colleague or boss. You don't have to love them, but you have to come from a place of love, whether for yourself or for the situation, because it needs to get better. When you develop a strong self-concept through self-care and recognize that you're in charge of your own well-being, that volatile person will no longer have power over you. At the very worst, it might mean leaving a relationship or maybe your job. But in the best case scenario, you find a healthier way to communicate, but you get off the emotional roller coaster that has left you feeling beat up on the inside. It's important to understand that you're not trying to change the other person. That's not within your power. Your happiness is not contingent on the other person changing. Your happiness comes from your own ability to know what you want and deserve, to establish healthy boundaries and continue to have healthy relationships with that person, or know when it's time to part ways. But the good news is that no matter how long this has been your pattern, it is never too late to make a change. You can always choose to have the life you want. And it starts with the belief that you deserve it and taking baby steps to get it. All right, friends, that's all I have for you this week. I look forward to talking to you next time, and I hope you have a great week. And bye for now. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Overthinker's Guide to Joy. If you're enjoying these episodes, please subscribe or follow this podcast so you can always be in the know when the next episode drops. If you would like to learn more about working with me as a coach, you can connect with me through my website at jackiedecrenis.com. That's JACKIEDECRINIS.com.